Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. All right, we're here with Jennifer Robson from Carleton University. Jennifer had a really great piece out over the weekend, which I have linked in the description below, about kind of where we're at in the economic situation. And she's talking about disinflation, which is not deflation. There's a very, very big difference between the two. And she kind of put together some of the things that I've been the disparate thoughts that have been going through my head through all the data I'm seeing. So Jennifer, I guess where I would start would be on the macro level, we seem to be doing pretty good. We've avoided a recession. Unemployment is still near record lows. Wage growth on average is outpacing inflation and has been for months and months and months. But we are also still seeing all this talk about economic doom and record numbers at food banks and MPs talking about how this is the worst they've seen since the Great Depression, which I think is just a little bit hyperbolic, but they are hearing things. So talk about how your piece kind of put all of this together.
Well, so first of all, hi, thanks for having me back. And thanks for also reading the piece and for sharing it with your viewers and your audience. So this piece was really inspired as I was getting ready to talk to the Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister, Chrystia Freeland, to give my 2 cents worth in terms of her budget plans. And I had also read a piece by the fantastic US economist Claudia Sam, who had put together kind of a bunch of different data points trying to make sense, right? Like the US is also kind of in this weird space where on the one hand, they're experiencing a disinflation while wages are growing, while unemployment is still at record lows. And yet there's this sense, right? Like there's the Vibecession problem of people are feeling like, I don't feel like it's getting better for me. But so she pulled together all of this data and took a look. And the story that she came up with in the States was like, look, actually, the average US household is measurably better off today. And even more so in the United States, it's the lowest income households that are significantly better off compared to where they were before the pandemic. And I thought, I want to know if that's the same here in Canada or not. And exactly as you're saying, right? Like the top line indicators for us are likewise pretty darn good, right? Like inflation is coming down. Unemployment has not spiked, despite fears and all the rest of it. And yes, as I heard as well in the weekly financial update from the government, the federal government, from the Minister of Finance, that yes, wages are growing. And as a matter of fact, if you look at what the Bank of Canada is saying, they're worried about wages, right? So there's this whole issue of like what is happening at the aggregate, right? When you pool all Canadians together versus. Let's unpack it a little bit and think about the distributional effects here because those matter. Macro policy is like, it's a really blunt tool, right? Yeah. Like they set the interest rate, it's the interest rate for everybody, right? Yeah. And your capacity to weather that differs a lot though, based on kind of where you sit in the pecking order. So yeah, my piece was really driven more for like, trying to figure out what's going on below the surface.
And talk to me a little more about these distributional effects because we don't often see them in the top line numbers.
No, we don't. No, of course not. Right? Like CPI is CPI, right? Like it's the inflation rate. Yeah. So what I did was I want to just acknowledge this is I took a couple of different data points again, like kind of trying to pull together where the indicators where we can get our hands on. And so one of the first things I did was take a look at the Bank of Canada's own survey on consumer expectations. One of the really interesting questions they ask is essentially like if you had to assign a dollar value to, or a number value to, or rather, sorry, not dollar value, although probably people think about it that way too.
Yeah.
But what is your expected probability of being laid off in the next year? Right. And what we see here is that basically high income households, they're not worried. They're not worried. Like their sensitivity to feeling like they're about to get laid off hasn't really budged since before the pandemic. middle income households, like they had a period of anxiety, of heightened anxiety about that, obviously, during the pandemic period. But for low income households, what we're seeing is that their anxiety continues to tick upwards. So that's sort of like, okay. All right, concern number one, right? And seeing how that's playing out. And again, like low income households, they're not stupid. They know that they are, like, in good times and in bad, more vulnerable to being laid off.
Yeah.
But from a macro perspective, right, what you are thinking about is like, okay, if labor markets are softening, then wage pressures will cool. People who fear that they might get laid off soon are probably going to take some kind of precautionary steps, right? Vis-a-vis like trying to build up a bit of a nest egg. And so I was interested in finding out, like, okay, we know who's worried about losing their job and who's not. Are the people who are worried also the savers? And no, they're not. It turns out, no, they are not.
Right.
The people who are continuing to build up savings or to basically be able to dip into so-called excess savings are not the same people who are worried, not the same low income households. So there is this issue, right, around the interest rate is supposed to create certain pressures, both on households, of course, and employers, and just, kind of more broadly.
Yeah.
But the bank has said, look, we're still worried about those wage pressures, right? So when the finance minister stands up and says, hey, wages have been growing faster than inflation, than CPI.
Yeah.
She goes, this is a good thing. At the Bank of Canada, folks are going like, oh no. No, we don't want this. We want softer wages.
Yeah.
So then So yeah.
Because, just for viewers, there is a phenomenon called a wage price spiral, where if wages keep going up, then prices need to go up in order to pay for those wages, and that can cause inflation because it keeps spiraling in that direction. Which is also why in the 70s they were wage and price controls and not just price controls. So that's just some background for people.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, if you're worried, that your wages are not going to go up, if your income is not going to go up, right, that changes your behavior as a consumer.
Yeah.
Right. For sure. So the Bank of Canada is, again, sort of looking at these sort of aggregate indicators where, overall wages in Canada are rising at about, it hovers between 3% and 5%, basically.
Yeah. The average hourly wage for permanent employees has been between 4% and 5% for months and months and months now. According to StatsCan data. So.
Yeah. And again, I mean, some of this issue is like, okay, are you using payroll data? Are you surveying, like calling up workers and asking them? Are you again, like you qualified that by saying it's the full-time, full-year workers. So there are a lot of different ways of trying to figure out what's going on with wage growth. And the Bank of Canada, has a nice kind of way of trying to mush this all together, right? And so what they're looking at is going like, okay, across these different indicators where we sort of weight some and that kind of thing, we're a little worried that wages are running high. But again, when you break this down, you discover whose wages have been increasing. Well, low-income households saw their wages from the pandemic to now, from before the pandemic, from the beginning of 2019 until now, rise just 2%.
Yeah.
Yeah. So like they are not experiencing wages. Highest income households, they have seen over that same time period, their wages increase a cumulative 21%. Yeah. So, the aggregate 5 conceals an awful lot of difference kind of below the surface there. And again, this is really challenging, right, from a monetary perspective, because they've got the one tool. They've got the one tool in terms of the interest rate. They have the tools in terms of how to communicate and so forth and trying to set expectations and that sort of thing. But, kind of where I landed as we think about what's going on and what should be in the budget is like, there's actually still room here for fiscal policy, right? That so long as some of this inflation remains sticky, and again, we think that the vast majority of the inflation was driven not by excess demand, but problems with supply.
Yeah.
And in terms of global instability right now, it's not like that has totally cleared up.
No,
right?
no.
So, maybe there's a room here or space here for thinking about smart, targeted, focused fiscal support, not helicopter money. Remember back in
Yes.
2020 when a whole bunch of provincial governments just basically sent out like checks to everybody, right?
Yeah.
You live in the province, you filed a tax return, you get money, whether you needed it or not. I
And
don't think we need that.
even after inflation started running hot, you still had some provinces who were insisting on helicopter money, even though that could make inflation worse.
And so this is the issue, right? Is like
Yeah.
part of the debate and the tension is, okay, when you have all of these different moving pieces, do you end up making things worse by pursuing certain kinds of fiscal policy? And if you believe that some degree, right, of, because again, I think we've established most of the inflationary pressures of food supply. It's not necessarily from people having too much money sloshing around and wanting to buy too much stuff, right? The demand side.
Yeah.
But if you believe that there is any part of that, you don't want to fuel that, right? Like you don't want to fuel increased demand. And when you just drop money from a helicopter on everybody, that's when you're most likely to be doing that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So with this in mind, I guess what kinds of fiscal tools should the government be thinking about, given the vast disparities in what we're seeing through the data?
Yeah. Well, I mean, so look, um, if the federal government wanted to influence wages, right? I mean, I think one of these stories that we're seeing below the surface here is like no real wage growth for the very low income households. Some of that is going to be driven by the fact that in some jurisdictions, minimum wages haven't really been keeping up with inflation, right? They're not necessarily indexed.
Yeah.
Federal government doesn't really have the tools to do that, but except for, the power of like kind of public statements and persuasion sort of thing, but they cover a very small share of the workforce, most of whom don't make minimum wage.
Yeah, they did reintroduce the federal minimum wage as a way of trying to influence provinces to kind of keep pace, but not all provinces are in agreement with that.
I don't know that Daniel Smith feels a moral obligation to keep up with the federal minimum wage.
Yeah.
Put that out there. So I don't know that they have much on that tool, but again, and I would defer to smarter economists than I who specialize in this. I think that there are reasonable concerns that have been asked about the impact of lower wage temporary foreign workers and making it easier for students to work for pay so much off campus that might be kind of flooding the supply of workers who are willing to work for low wage jobs, right? So I think there's some stuff there to at least unpack and think through as the government thinks about where to go next. And I think that this data that I've been pulling together also suggests, there's room for stuff that is really targeted to people in the lowest income households. So if you think about existing tools, things like the GST credit, right? Things like the Canada Workers Benefit, where that can, help with regards to some of these cost pressures where clearly market wages are not keeping pace, but it's nicely targeted. And I'm not sure that we necessarily need to do kind of a, like they did last year, sort of let's double the credit or let's permanently make it twice as big or whatever, right? I know there have been some proposals out there, but hey, here's one little simple thing they could do. Index it more frequently. If we're in a period of greater volatility, this is what we do for seniors, and it really does make a difference for seniors in terms of having their benefits keep up with changes to prices. So that's one thing that they could do. And again, if we get back to low stable inflation, great. It'll, that won't cost anything more. So there you go. There's one idea that I hope if anybody from finance is listening.
All right. Well, thanks so much for taking the time to walk us through this, because I think it's important that we have a better idea of what's happening on when we're seeing these numbers out there. And thanks again, and we'll do this again.
Thanks for having me.
All right. Cheers.
Take care.
And that's everything for this week. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. It's at journo_Dale on Twitter and journodale_no_ on Bluesky. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.